Hey, it's Betsy here. Before we get started with this episode, I've got some exciting news to share. I'm finally done with all the changes I have been making to my own brand positioning, my offers, my messaging, and my website. I've been working on this somewhere when I was in the middle of my sabbatical, and it may have taken longer than I expected, but I am super excited and proud of the results because I feel like for the first time, there's no part of me that's missing and there's no part of me that's playing small. I'm showing up with the full power of what I do, not for my own sake alone, but for my client's sake, because this is a big part of the why that drives me. I believe deeply in the transformational we consultants and coaches do. And I know what's at risk when we settle for less than our potential or showing up on the market as those world's best kept secret. Our clients have no choice when we play small to turn to other people who are just better at getting the word out about who they are and what they do, but just have a fraction, just a small smidgen of the heart and the talent of the people that I want to work with. So I invite you to please head on over to my new website at www.betsyjordan.com. And don't forget, Jordan is with a Y, not an A. Love for you to get inspired by my success stories, learn more about how I've accelerated the success and impact of countless consultants and coaches. Be sure to check out my services page and learn more about how I've repackaged what I do into a very customized strategic brand partnership so that I could help you accelerate your ability to get to your next level of success and impact faster. So, without further ado, no more talking about that. Let's get on to the show. So, what is the power of consultants and coaches, particularly those who work in organizations? How do we deliver results when we don't have formal authority? And how do we live our values around respect for people and our passion for people centered cultures in the face of current legislation that is creating real, not imagined, real barriers? And what is the role of consultants in social impact? These are deep questions, these are challenging questions. And these also are questions get to the heart of what we do in our true purpose and role, and they don't always have clear and easy answers. So for this reason, I'm so excited that Peter Block, the one and only Peter Block, is here to answer these questions for you today on this episode of the Consulting Matters podcast. And welcome to Consulting Matters. I'm your host, Betsy Jordan, and I am deeply honored, deeply privileged to have on the show Peter Block. So, he is the author of Flawless Consulting, which is the book that so many of us in the consulting profession see as our Bible, which is what I read when I was a brand new OD consultant at Disney. And I did not realize how much Peter's perspective has shaped my own perspective and approach to consulting until I reread Flawless Consulting over my sabbatical. I invited him on the show because, well, I'm fangirl. And also, I wanted him to be able to share with you firsthand his perspective on consulting, our role and purpose, and what it really takes to create the type of organizations that really serve everybody and serve the common good. So I wanted him on the show for that reason as well. Because as you could tell, this matters to me because the title of my podcast is all about consulting matters and what we do matters and how we show up matters. The question is how do we fulfill our role and purposes today with leaders who are even more stuck in the short-term thinking with the current external pressures, and how do we stay the course for greater good? So all of this and more is what Peter and I discuss. Okay, so without further ado, it's my deepest honor, career privilege to have you on the show. Welcome to the show, Peter. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Betsy. Every invitation matters, and yours especially, so thank you.
Thank you for saying that. We need to start our conversation with I know where my listeners are at and where my head was at when I first thought about it is the book Flawless Consulting. It's a classic. Anybody who's been in the consulting space looks at it as their Bible. I would love to get a little bit more into your head around like why did you write the book and like what were you hoping to shift in thinking, what people were thinking about consulting? You said that there was certain things that you were ideas that you were synthesizing. What ideas were you synthesizing and what were you trying to put forth in that book?
I had spent, um, 15, 18 years in organization development, and we started early We did team building, we worked with bringing people together, and I started giving talks about the work we were doing, and this guy started asking me to write a book, and I said, "Leave me alone. I talk, I don't type. Leave me alone." 4 months later, another talk on consulting skills, ASTD, because we were running workshops there, so we had translated into experiences, which was the point. And finally, he said, "I'll give you money if you write the book." And I said, "You got yourself an author."
Wow.
And so I wrote the book, and I was very unsure that what I had known in OD was translatable to people doing staff work in the real world. The influence of the book came from my own participation in Gestalt therapy and where I live in my head. Okay, I don't have a body. And when I went into Gestalt therapy, they sat me down and said, "Peter, how do you feel?" I said, "What do you mean by that?" "Peter, how do you feel?" "What do you mean by that?" "Peter, what do you want?" "I don't know what you're talking about." And I got the point that experience was different than analyzing experience, and it had a huge impact on my life. And so that became my practice. And I realized if you ask people what they want from each other, it's a whole different experience than if you ask people how they think about things,
Mm,
how they analyze. And now, Gestalt had a very crude word for that, but we can call it intellectualizing is different than experience and being with somebody. And so I took the word from Gestalt therapy and a few other places that was my own healing and said, well, let me write the book for this guy. And then I was working at Exxon, Esso at the time, and all my clients were IT people and engineers. So I said, let me write this for engineers. And so I really tried to make it accessible for people uninterested in everything else I was doing. And I was very nervous that my peers in OD would say, Peter, and the model was a cookbook. And so my goal was to put a lot of boxes, a lot of steps, a lot of white space, and make it easy. And once I finished it, you know, was embarrassed. I hope my partners don't read this because they will discover how ridiculously practical I am. And somehow I've asked myself why it worked. Okay. And I think what it makes very accessible the process of contact, relationship being the essence of influence and
mm,
real, authentic, making a difference. And for the IT people I was working with, that was a radical thought. The guy who ran IT for Esso came to us and he says, we would do all these studies and we're not wrong. And nobody does anything about it. What's going on here? And so we began running workshops for his IT people with the ideas of why aren't people acting on what they know and what you know. And
s-
that's kind of how the thing began was to say, well, the relationship is the delivery system for my expertise. And that I somehow gave form to that that was useful and simple enough to be accessible.
could you say that again? My relationship skills are the delivery system for my expertise.
Yes, my our relationship, you and I, right now, Betsy, have content we want to bring. Okay. How you and I are with each other will make it real or make it a speech.
Mm,
So and every time I'm with a client, I need to connect with him. And so the methodology, and then we turn it into workshops and stuff, is to ask people, how do you feel about working with me? IT people don't do that. Now they do. Ask people, what doubts do you have about how this is going? Nobody does that. Now they do. Ask people, oh, tell me what you're up against. And when people give me a hard time, oh, tell me what have you done this before? Where else was it
well,
done? Where they want evidence and data? I don't answer the question. and say, "You have doubts about whether this is a good fit, don't you?" And so traditionally, I would sell. Yeah, I've worked 7 different places, 3 different things. Here's my no, my job in selling is to help them make a good decision.
It's like we talked before we got on this call, like, it's crazy for me to hear this, like, I have chills, is that I I knew that your book had influence. I had no idea, like, my entire philosophy of every single thing that I do as a consultant and as a branding person, even my entire approach, like, I never call, like, what we do in as consultants when we land work, I never call it sales or even contracting, I call it partnership setup. And I think because that idea that you had so many years ago around it's the relationship, I am the agent of change. This is why, like, to me, personal branding is so important. Is like, I am the agent of change. It's not my methodology, it's not my expertise, it's me. And I'm so, like, I'm, like, in awe, like, I understand what you're talking about at a very deep level, like, that's really powerful, and I think what's so interesting as you say it is that message might have been radical, like, when you wrote the book, but it's still radical today. Like, people still don't get that the role that we have as consultants is not about our expertise, but it's about how we're showing up. Like, why is it that this is so hard for so many of us to see and appreciate? Is it's the relationship skills, our consulting skills more than our expertise that matters.
I have a good friend who's a venture capitalist, and he worked for J&J, and J, and then he went on his own. And I'm talking to him, and he says, "You know, when they decide to invest or not, they look across the table and ask themselves, 'Who is this person?'"
Mm.
And that's so it's not just consulting, but it's uneasy to focus on this, and, uh, and it's simple, but it takes courage, and you know, and what you said about selling is very important. We were in business for years, Tony and I started OD stuff, and we felt we were horrible at marketing. So we brought in a marketing person, and we had a focus group with our customers. And we asked them, "Why did you hire us?" And they said, "'Cause you didn't seem to give a damn whether you got the job or not."
Mhm.
And we thought we were bad at marketing. We were great salesmen because we didn't give a shit.
You know, I had a situation like that when I was new into consulting. Is there was a situation where I was, like, in the process of a conversation with a client, and they were setting up, like, pay like a get out of jail free terms that was not going to be in the company's best interest. It could have been mine. They were gonna pay me quite a bit, like, per month, and I said, "No," I'm like, "This is not in the best interest of the client, this is not in your best interest, I have to say no." And then, a couple of years later, then they brought me back in, I'm like, "I don't understand, I said no," and they said, "It's because you said no." And I think that there is something about the ethics of our work is when you go in with this belief around, like, I just am here to be of service, and if I'm not the right fit or if this is not the right thing, I don't wanna do the work, that I think that actually increases trust and credibility with
Yes.
your clients. Would you agree?
Oh, it's beautifully said. I more than agree. It's beautifully said. And it's not that I don't care. I want the business. But if it's not good business, it's bad for business.
Right.
'Cause all I figure someday all the clients will talk to each other. Just like I figure someday all the children and wives will talk to each other. And
Oh my god.
the worst thing that can happen to me is when they clients all talk to each other, okay? It doesn't they have doubts about me, and so I feel it's in my interest to say no to jobs that I don't think are gonna work. Uh,
Uh-huh.
now it's and, it's hard because we had to face the decision, do we wanna grow a consulting business? All I wanted to do is make a living, and we decided not to. A lot of people were going and had 50, 70 consultants, and, Tony and I said, "Let's have 5 or 6, because what's the point? We're making a good living." And so it but the culture is so, mm, present, sales, growth, speed, okay, replicability, where, evidence-based, none of it works. It's just appealing. And
Hmm.
so that's why we need each other. That's why we're having this conversation. Because this afternoon, we're gonna be in a situation where we're gonna have to remember what we said to each other.
I have so many things I wanna ask you about because I read Activating the Common Good, and there was something that you said about being the roving listener that I really resonated with, and I know I'm gonna jump ahead, a little bit, and I'll jump back into flawless consulting, but I do feel like that's a big part of, like, what we're trying to do is that there's room for all of us, all different kinds of consultants, and if we have that scarcity mindset, like, I have to grow the business, like, and I don't see that there's a bigger play with different kinds of gifts that I could bring to the table, can you just, like, quickly bring in the roving listener, and then let's just jump back then we'll jump back into
There's
flawless
there
consulting.
there there's no forward and backward, okay? We don't have a map and ground we have to cover.
Okay.
Diehl and Hargis worked for a church in Indianapolis, and, the pastor there was wondering whether they were making a difference as he and too many kids in his neighborhood were being buried. And so he said, maybe the programs we're running are not healing and helping. And so Diehl lived in the neighborhood. He said, would you go knock on doors and ask people what they're good at, what their gifts are, what do they love to do? And they stopped their programming, stopped their sports competitions in the summer. It wasn't saving lives. It was popular. And Demon came back after a while, 6 months or so, and he says, "Well, they love to fish. They love to take care of kids. They love the community garden. They love to spend time. They're good at fixing things." And he said, "Okay, this church is going to organize its outreach according to the gifts of the people around us." And it made a huge difference. And so that's the tension between selling something. And so and Demon's he's 25 years into that. And now he builds his neighborhood. And when philanthropists want to come, he says to them, "Thank you for your interest," because it's a vulnerable neighborhood. "But we're not sure we want to work with you. Would you please come to dinner?" This is to, Ford Foundation. And they do. And they come to dinner. His friends who know how to cook invite him, say, "This is so and so, and I'd like him to get a sense of who we are." Changes everything. And they then show us what you think you can do, philanthropists. It inverts everything. And so Dillon shows up as a partner, and he has no trouble raising money.
I love that because it's it's really bringing in the inherent value of people and on our differences in terms of, like not our differences like we're separated, but it's like we're all designed uniquely, and I think that this is a big part of, like, what I'm passionate about and, like, why I gave up consulting to do what I do now is that there's so many of us with so many unique skills, and I think that we all can serve the same organizations or different organizations, and I think when you move into the gift realm, you move out of scarcity is that there's abundance because there's a whole purpose for
They're not.
everybody, and we all have a place.
Yes, and we get connected, and we don't have to compete with each other. People even a consulting business. Uh, when I was selling, say, "Well, we're talking to 3 other groups." And I say, "Wow, they're amazing. Enjoy yourself." I choose not to compete. There's enough for all of us. And the scarcity is a means of controlling people. It's not by accident. It's not because original sin kind of found a market in the church. It's because it's easy to control the world if you convince them that they should be afraid. And we start competing in the first grade. It's a market mindset that's fine for the market, but it should dominate who we choose to be together. And what you're saying is And somebody said, "You might as well be yourself because everybody else is taken."
I love that.
But we do it to make a difference in the world. We do it both to connect, to overcome my isolation, let me know I'm not crazy, but it doesn't become powerful unless we say, "Let now what do we wanna do together? Alright, that's see, we had this conversation. So, let's keep each other in mind." And in neighborhoods and in businesses, they don't focus on peers building trust with each other and deciding now what do we wanna create, which is an abundant enough mindset, and stop save me from performance appraisals.
I wonder, you used the word control a couple times, and I wonder, like, underneath it, for those who are not familiar with the term flawless consulting and what you mean by that, and, what the value is it really about having a different relationship with control and power and not necess because I think, like, consultants wind up feeling like, "I have to grab at something because I have to, like I wanna create results, but I have no authority. So now where do I get my control?" Like, is there something that has to do with, like, flawless consulting and how it relates to our relationship with power and control, or is that they're 2 totally different concepts?
No, I think it says influence when you don't have control. What they don't know, anybody listening, I hope not, nobody has control.
Yeah.
It's an illusion. You're the boss, you're the president. I once worked with a large food chain. I met the CEO. "Hi, hi, my name's Peter." He says, "I can't get them to thicken the damn ketchup." Here I am, this corner office. So control's an illusion, you know? You need order, you need structure, but the idea that I can control human behavior or even technology, it doesn't work very well. It's just appealing.
So you're saying even the executives don't have control. That's an illusion as much as the consultants who feel like I don't have a role on the positional I don't have a positional authority. I need to help the people who have control, and they don't even really have control.
They don't they well, they can't make a product work.
Right.
They can't deliver a service. The chef knows everything about cuisine, and the servers decide whether I come back or not. The line cooks decide whether I come back or not. So I'm the chef, and most chefs that start businesses, it doesn't go well because they think they have and so control is different than impact, and, you know, now they do have some power, and I like hierarchy. You need bosses. Somebody's gotta look at the whole picture and tell us what to focus on. But the idea that we can control by measuring things by outcomes is an illusion. It's just satisfying. Now
Huh.
they do have the power to fund or to say no, but they have the power to stop things, not to create things.
So is there a difference between power and control? And if
I
so,
think
what are the differences?
well, it's power you can work with, but it doesn't matter. The with is what matters, and the best executives realize that they gotta be present, and it's rare, it's hard, it's the news media, the journalism world, makes money off the illusion of control, who's in charge, the corner office. Most of what the corner office does is manage the news.
Mm. It's still like processing what this looks like to have power versus control because it feels like if I am connected to whether I feel empowered, I feel like that there's a thematic element, across the books that you write is
Right,
like
yeah,
about
there's
where the
agency.
empowerment and agency, but control, like the even your model around resistance is a masked expression of loss of control or vulnerability. And it's a mass expression over something that is an illusion to begin with, like that you don't have control to be you don't even have control, but we wanna have control. And even, like, some of the clients that I work with, it's like, "Okay, I don't wanna go into consulting because I can't control my future. I'm gonna go get a job," but there's no control over there either because you can get laid off like that. But empowerment feels like, if I own my power, own my agency, I can make my future how I want my future, which is different than I can control my future. It just feels
Correct.
like there's a really
Beautiful.
important distinction, but I'm not quite sure how to
No,
describe the distinction here.
you just did.
Oh, he did? Okay.
Let's take this moment. This is your podcast. You're in charge. Betsy, I'm your guest. How much control do you have over how this is gonna go? You're gonna make it as wonderful an experience as you can, but, you know, hopefully, it will go well. But you can't and anytime other people involved, it doesn't and what you said about agency is very I am responsible for my life. It doesn't mean it's gonna turn out well,
Mhm.
but for me to surrender to the corporation, I do it for safety, okay? And I always think there's 2 lines, one is offers safety, the other offers freedom, and the line with safety is very long, and you get to the front and they say, "You want your safety?" "Yeah." And they go, "What do I have to pay for that safety?" Well, you give up choice, agency, and influence over your life. You up for that? Absolutely. Could we talk about retention bonuses? I mean, you're you said it beautifully. The other line is freedom and agency. My life is my own. And the price I pay for that is anxiety. And it's
Mm.
empty. And it's an illusion of safety. It's a parent's wish for a child. And people say, I'm proud of my children. Really? Did you are they Are you taking credit for them? I know you brought them into the world, but if you ever raised children, so let go of that. And it's fine for 7-year-olds. I wanna control how they spend their afternoons, but not 22-year-olds. And so the whole parenting thing, and what you said was beautiful. You're right. It is a distinction, and we have a choice. And what the consulting does, it gives shape to what a choice feels like, and when you feel it and do it in a workshop, you realize it rewards me in ways I didn't know were possible. Like, one of the things we do in the workshop is we have people sit in front of a video, now it's an iPhone, and videotape themselves saying what they want from key people that they work with. "I want you to stop this, I want you to start that, I want you to keep this." And then we stop it, give them 2 minutes, and then we have them watch it, and, they were the group of 3 or 4 other people all watching, and we asked them, "What did you like that you saw?" "Well, I should." "No. What did you like that you saw?" And as soon as they say that and see that, something shifts, and they realize I'm not too much. I
Mm.
declare the world what I want. I can't live without telling the world what I want. I can live without getting it, and so we use the experience of a circle of 4 people. And then the other 3 or 4 people say, "Well, here's what we liked that you did." And once I see that, then I'm more willing to enter the world with as an agent, as a relational activist, as a consultant, have influence with no control.
So it's sort of like even as change agents, we go into an organization and we have our own resistance because we have these theories of theories about control, that there's like this myth that we have control. And if we could shift the myth of control to power and empowerment and vulnerability from the standpoint of like it's a skill, like vulnerability is a skill that you could develop. If I could kind of flip to that point and I'm willing to be in that space, then I can create more of the the impact, the influence more directly. It's almost like you as a consultant have to go first, do your own work before you even try to touch the system, because if you're kind of in that zone, you're not gonna be able to really affect anybody else. I don't know if I'm hearing any of this correctly, or am I going in a different direction?
You're such a fool. What you said is perfect. You
Oh, good.
every time you say something, you say, "What's wrong with me?" Nothing. You may not be
I
right, but there's nothing wrong with us. So you're right. And we do it because that's the way to make a difference. And even the word change agent is is a collusion with the patriarchy, a collusion with the control. We're partners. You're a consultant. You're in the service business, but am I an agent of whose change am I an agent of? And I always made sense to me to say, well, I resist coercion. I don't resist change. I'm waiting for my transformation. What you're offering, Betsy, to the world is the notion that for people in the consulting world, or whoever you're with, you're looking for people looking for you.
mm,
And, and some people aren't. And you say, bless you. I wish you well. It was good being with you. And then you find people that have been looking for you and you say, well, what do we want to do together? And I always felt in the years I was consulting that I was looking for people looking for me. And that what I wrote about was what they taught me.
I love that. I feel like you just summarized, like, the whole mission of what I do is, like, helping people, look for the people who are looking for them and create that authentic relationship, the collaboration. And so that you can make a bigger difference because we each have different roles in the whole kit and caboodle, and one thing that I'm really clear about, when I was a consultant and what I teach my clients is that there is a leader and it's not you. They're there and you're there to come alongside, enhance their capacity, enhance their decision-making clarity, and all that kinda stuff. And I think anytime we kinda, like, wanna jump over, like, I think you called it, like, there's the pair of hands trap, and then there's, like, the expert, and then the collaborator in the middle. Why do we wanna jump in as the expert in the, pair of hands versus being the person in the middle?
Uh, uh, yes, I got that from Ed Schein years ago. Uh, Part of it, we have to deal with their expectation. Their expectations are very low. I want you, what are you expert in? Here's what I want you to do. Will you do it? And so people rarely are looking for a partner, but uh, I could still show up that way.
Right.
Halfway through every sales call. And I'll do that now with you. How is this going? Are you getting what you want? So we're used to processing the world after it's over. How did it go? It's too late, you know. So let me ask you, how is this conversation going, Betsy? Are you
Mhm.
getting what you want?
Yes. And then some. I feel like I'm, like, at the feet of the master in a way, like, it's just so interesting and validating, and illuminating too, because there's some concepts that it's like, okay, it's like you're forcing me to, and not in a good way, to kind of, like, there's all these ideas that I had shaking around in my head. Like, I have a real problem with employee engagement. Let's just take that one for example. Like, I think a lot of the ways that we think about employee engagement feels, like, almost unethical because it feels like we're treating, employees like children, like, "Oh, I need to make sure I give them a friend at work, and they have a boss who knows their name." And, but we're not gonna give them a voice in the work that affects them, like that, and we're not going to, we're asking them to give up their hearts and minds to this organization that has no limbic brain for them to even attach to. There's no real security, and it feels like there's an alternative model that we should be having that provides maybe not employee engagement, employee empowerment, or employee agency, employee ownership, but the field is not going in that direction. That's not what the employee engagement surveys are. People who are trying to create these people-centered organizations outside of my new I'm newly discovered the whole lean world from the Japanese roots. And it's like that feels like more in alignment with what the organizations are supposed to be. Like there's real respect for people, but there's so much of this other like modern Western approach to employee engagement that doesn't feel 100% correct to me. Can you speak to that?
It's a marketing strategy. How do we act as if we care about people's point of view when we and the quality movement was a real embodiment of that. And but other cultures, I know if you travel around the world, this one's the hardest to work in. Okay, and I've been to China, and I've been to Singapore, I've been to all these places that culture, 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 Germany. And so what you said was beautiful. Don't yeah, employee surveys are useless unless you ask them about themselves.
Uh-huh.
So if I cared about it, I would say to the employee, "I don't care about how you feel about your supervisor or the company, or do you feel cared for, how I don't wanna know how good a parent we are." You said it beautifully. I wanna know how much, choice do you have, and do
Mm.
you take over the way you like to work? Uh, to what extent do you feel you're competing with your peers or learning and engaging in? To what extent, are you willing to acknowledge when something goes wrong? But use the survey to get them talking to each other. There's nothing you can do with survey results. And we're being bombarded now. Everybody who wants to raise money from me for a campaign begins with a survey. Okay. And the survey says, "Do you believe the sky is blue? Do you feel that you're standing on the earth? Good. Would you donate?" And I write back, "Stop this." And the employee surveys is a marketing strategy to give the illusion that we care about our people. I think by and large, they do care about their people. It's just that they need you to give them the means to express it in a more powerful way. Because and we can do that. Every person listening, every client you have and we have in our workshop, wherever I am, I always have a choice as to how I want to show up there. And once in a while, I can actually design it. And I used to do this. I used to give keynotes, okay? Podium, high fees, microphone. I'm standing, they're sitting. Okay. Here's Peter, keynote speaker. And after 8 minutes, I would say, "Thank you. I'd like to break you into groups of three and answer the following question. Why was it important for you to be here today? Come back in 8 minutes." That's not what we came here for. We came here to listen to you. I know. I didn't come here to meet your expectations because I know it doesn't work.
Right.
And then, so each of us can do that, whatever gathering we're in. Get people to address questions they're not used to having. What doubts do you have about what we're doing? There's no place for dissent in a plantation or a high control culture. Are
So
you with us?
that's the evolution from flawless consulting to some of your later work was moving more to the collective, having the conversation, the participation. That's where the thinking has evolved since flawless consulting.
Yes. It began with a community book, and it began with my stepping out of the corporate context after 30 years and deciding maybe there's another place to be that would make more sense to me.
So it seems like you, like Meg Wheatley, like it seems like people have been in our field for a long time. Seems that we wind up like with some sort of like spiritual perspective and a systems point of view that goes far beyond organizations. And we have like this vision for, what the systems of the world can look like. And it seems like you have a very clear view of the systems of or how we can create the systems of the world. I would love for you to expand a little bit more on activating the common good like, or just, like, kinda do the breadcrumbs from flawless consulting to activating the common good, and if you can share a little bit about the common good and what you mean by that, because there's a common good perspective versus the business perspective, and what does that look like, and what's the implication for consultants? I know I just threw, like, tons of questions at you, but, I think you like, number 1, like, the breadcrumbs, like, from this book,
I got
from
it.
flawless consulting to
Let me
activating.
let me complain. I don't talk about a systems perspective because most of the systems we have aren't working very well. The electoral system, the council system, the mayor system, they're not working.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't but the crumbs are that over time, you begin to believe in what you always wrote about. It took me decades before I it's not that I didn't believe it, it just thought, "Well, I wrote a book and it sold. How lucky am I?" And then you write another book, and so my early context was organizations and empowerment, uh, and you don't know what the book is until after you write it.
Mm, that's
So
interesting.
the reason you write a book is to know for me to understand what the hell I'm trying to say. And so stewardship was giving up choice, but it was still focused on the leader versus manager. And then I context just widened, and I think the I got invited to give a talk to some change-minded city managers, and I fell in love with them. I thought, "Oh my god, they're not interested in utilities. They're interested in citizens engaging each other to make the place better." And they started inviting me, paying me to come to their cities. And they put me in with 100 citizens. "Okay, Peter, hotshot consultant." And I realized that they had everything they needed with each other. And the city
Mm.
managers were beautiful. They believed in citizenship. And so you begin to realize, and so then I wrote a book on community, and I tried it. And I realized there's something going on in communities. And so the other thing I learned was uh, arguing doesn't work. And so whenever you write a book, it's because you're mad at something. And so the first 40 pages are you putting your anger into words on a page or on a screen. And they say, okay, now I'm ready to write a book. And you extract all the anger. And so it doesn't work to say these people are wrong. And the last book is my frustration that the common good is what we care about. I wanted to call the book We Are Not Divided.
Oh,
It's not that we don't see the world differently, but it's not the point. I don't care how you see the world. I care what we want to create together. And so I've done enough work in different domains to realize there's a whole movement out there of churches caring more about the community than filling the chapel. There's architects wanting people to connect with their neighbors rather than going 7 stories and maximizing income from an acre. There's police who says my job is to keep people out of the judicial system. And you say, "Oh my god." And so the activism, anytime I'm waiting for someone else's transformation, when I worked for companies, but you wanna meet with the CEO, you wanna meet with the board, you wanna meet with top management, I say, "Why would I wanna do that?" The only reason is it makes the sales call more efficient.
right.
But I don't believe the top has the power. They may have the will, but they fundamentally create the kind of common and the things we care about. So I just wanted to give expression to that. And and the things we care about are how to raise a child, how to be safe, how to be healthy. You can't outsource those things. I thought I could schools would raise my children. You'd ask the school building to do everything. And so the whole idea is how about we, you and I, in a place, decide what we want to do to care for these children, to keep each other safe. The more social contact I have, and there's data on this, it says my work with Association of Life, well, I put 100 hours a year into working with something, some cause, I live 2 years longer.
Mm.
What? What? So,
So the breadcrumbs is really simple, is that it's not like write what you know isn't necessarily what the author's journey is, it's write what you experience, and so you were being invited into certain new arenas that was shaping your thinking and how you were feeling about it, and then as you were working through your concepts and working through, like, the frustration or what have you, like, then the new ideas seem to have emerged, and then it just seems to you went from organization, and then after organization, you just got put into other locales, if you will. And it's still the theme, though. It sounds like you're still saying the same theme is about empowerment, agency, collaboration, partnership. It seems like that's the through line no matter where the environment is. We partner together to create a citizen activist to create the common good. We partner together with our clients to create the organizations that we want. And as leaders, we create collaborative environments where people can talk and work, and solve problems together. And seems like there's just this empowerment collaboration theme that cuts across all of it.
Beautiful.
That's accurate. So I got it right. Yay.
That's beautiful. And when I get invitations from unexpected places, I take it seriously. So when I get invited to, parts of the government, I think, "Well, something's going on here." City
Uh-huh.
manager, something going on here. And I don't know, and I'm, like all of us, waiting to change my mind. And so when I read a book about a tennis teacher who teaches tennis without giving instructions, I said, "Wow." And he called me. So, but the high point of my career was when Tim Galway called me on the phone. He says, "Peter, you wrote me a letter. Could we talk?" And I s I wasn't okay. And, uh, and so I my gift is I don't need much to see things happen many times to know that they're true. And so you see one thing happen one place. I see Tim, uh, teaching without any instructions. I think, "Wow, so maybe I'm in the business of learning and not teaching." So we called the business Designed Learning.
Oh. Oh, I
Peter
have
Kestenbaum did that. I mean, yeah. And so each of these people, Warner Earhart, John McKnight, brought me into community and the gifts versus deficiency. Peter told me there's nothing wrong with me. All the things I thought were defects turns out to be that I'm a human being. But I'm able, my, I think one of my gifts is to see things that can matter and, and know there's something really important here. Let me spend 5, 6, 7 years trying to figure out what that is.
and it's like you're bringing forth, like, unique perspectives. Like, I spent a lot of time, like, wrestling with, activating the common good because it's so different and from a perspective.
Mm.
In terms of, like, even understanding the business perspective, when I read about the business I would love for you to explain a little bit about the business perspective versus the common good perspective, because when you were bringing it up, it kinda made me feel like, that parable where they're like, the fish are in the water, and one fish says to the other, like, "How's the water?" And it's like, "Oh." I feel like you brought this awareness, like, that there's a business perspective that permeates everything. Even, like, when I pictured, like, I was doing consulting in my early years when I first left Disney to start my own consulting business, I was doing work with churches that they wanted to bring in the business principles, and then I read through for your book, and I'm like, "Oh my god, that's why it didn't work." Like, there's something fundamentally off about this. Like, what is the business perspective? How is it different than the common good perspective?
It it's a distinction of where you put your attention, and I tried to write it in a neutral way, and I feel that way about it, okay? But if you see the world as that in a way that values speed, that it values scale, how fast can we take it to scale, values cost, how cheaply can we do it, how consistent can we be, how convenient can we be, and how can we convince consumers that there's something wrong with them.
Uh,
That's no, it's fine. Run your business that way, but don't run your church that way, don't run your school that way, don't run my neighborhood that way, don't run City Hall that way.
Right.
And so that's what I try to say as the business perspective. It's not an argument against capitalism. Late stage, early stage, save me from that conversation. It's not about an ism. You want to be a socialist, be a so none of them work except for, you know, commerce. But don't organize our lives around commerce or organize our lives around compassion, about connection, and stop running our schools as if their main job is to produce good employees. That's what
I
STEM does.
I
That's
love
the
that difference about the school output. You did say in the book about the output of a school, from that to, like, children knowing, "What am I good at?" Like, it
changed
seems
every
so revolutionary, but so good.
I know, I heard, Frances Strickland was the first lady of Ohio, and I heard her give a talk. I was on a panel with her, and she said, "I had one goal, and that was to have every 18-year-old know what they're good at in the state of
Mm,
Ohio." I heard that sentence and, oh my god, everything changed. And then you
mhm,
say, "If I took that serious." That's the struggle with the church. It has the language, it has the beauty, all the churches do. It but it's using a business perspective to live it out.
mhm,
The local churches have huge endowments, okay? And the trustees figure their job is to keep the endowments huge. And then you see one philanthropy group who said, "In 5 years, we're out of business." Oh my god, there's an option? And so that all of us are looking for those moments to believe in. That's why what you do, Betsy, is so important, because you have an enormous gift of capturing complicated things and making them accessible. And, you give me a reason to write, 'cause your understanding of my book teaches me something about it, and I'm grateful to you for that.
that means a lot. Thank you for saying that. That means a
Yeah,
lot. Um, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question because I know this is on a lot of my clients' mind. Um, as it relates to, like, a lot of, so if you're saying that common good perspective is not, like the business perspective can be in business, but and the common good perspective can be over here, but my clients' hearts beat for the common good perspective to be in business,
yes,
and they're up at night right now because they've cared deeply about people-centered organizations, work environments that welcome everybody. They care deeply about respect for people, and their mission is to create that in organizations, but right now, they are in an environment that is becoming increasingly hostile to that philosophy or those values. Like, they're struggling with leaders who are very short-term focused and don't wanna go beyond that. They have very nervous leaders who are in the middle of an economic, situation that's scaring them. But even worse is that their values around diversity, equity, and inclusion are almost, like, considered illegal, like, they're all on the chopping block, and so could you speak to, really the heart of a purpose-driven consultant or coach who wants to have that collaborative relationship, who wants to actually the common good perspective within an organization in a business context? What do they do now? What can you how can
beautiful.
you speak to their concerns?
Well, I get what you're saying, and it's never been more, uh, painful than it is now. It doesn't matter whether you're inside my common good thing is absolutely about organizational life. Just because I took it somewhere else, well, so what do we do in a movement? And we decide where to place our attention. I can decide where my attention goes, and I have to do something with the pain of what I see. AI, it's not that complicated. It's just a way of reducing labor costs. Okay, it's packaged as great science, and it's gonna take us to no. And so how can I treat that as interesting, but not the point? We together can decide where to pay our attention. And I'm looking for islands of possibility, islands of sanity, as Meg said. Are there 3 people in your company who are line managers who feel the same tension you do? And can we sit and talk to each other and say, what are the small places, you know, short moments where we can be together in a different way? Like, how about a staff meeting? How about if we stop using PowerPoint? Well, how about every time we hold a staff meeting, we break people into groups of 3 and say, what's most on your mind for the next hour we're spending together? Okay? I can do that. Nobody's watching. But so many of our protocols are so useless and they just reinforce us becoming instruments, the instrumentality. Part of the business perspective is to try to reduce things to predictable, organized, instrumental units. That was Ford's genius. He said, if I can break a car into 15,000 pieces and get people to do the same piece over and over again, I can produce a cheap car. And so look for those moments. It's small, it's slow. Uh, Stop caring about what top management thinks. Have
If I'm a
compassion.
consultant and I'm brought into the organization and, you know,
Who
like,
brought you
and
in?
it
Let's role play it right now.
okay. Oh, this is good.
I'll be the
Okay.
consultant, you bring me in.
Um,
"Hi,
so
Betsy.
d
Glad you called. What's up?"
okay, so wait, am I an organization that is resistant? Okay.
"Yeah,
Um,
yeah, resistant, yeah,
so
but call me."
Peter, I need your help because we're really worried about the recession with the tariffs. We have to, you know, move things offline. We might have to just like lay off a whole bunch of people in our workforce, and I just need you to do this. Like, tell me, what do I need to do to get myself recession proof and deal with these tariffs so that if they no matter which way they go, we can still be successful.
Okay, so be clear about what you want from our working together. Say it again slowly in a short
Okay.
sentence.
So I'm the executive.
I
I don't
know your situation. What do
Oh,
you
okay. Oh, I need you to make clear recommendations on how I need to move my where I need to move my supply chain and how do I to avoid any of the tariff ups and downs. And I need you to tell me how I need to right size my workforce so that I'm like
Okay,
recession proof.
okay, so part of what you want, I can't deliver. I cannot promise you anything that says you're this recession-proof, but let's talk about what matters to you and who are the people that we can work with together that can answer that question together. That's what I can do with you. I can't study and give you an answer that will mean anything. I can work with you, and I feel I can ask you later why these things matter to you. You care about the people. You don't know what to do with the supply chain, but let's talk about why it matters to you. And what I can do is help bring people together to collectively find a way to endure these terrible times. Are you interested or not?
So we're full circle is basically the solution to the problem that I posed at the end is really the question I asked you at the beginning, which is what the practices of flawless consulting
Exactly.
is still going in there as the partner and as the collaborator to create that conditions and then create high involvement solutions where people can be talking together.
Right.
That's the so what I would have done in good times or bad times
But man,
is the same.
and I also learned from my early days that what people present to you as the problem is never it.
I know, I say that all the time. I say the client's always wrong,
They're not
always
wrong.
wrong.
It's called a
Yeah,
presenting problem.
yeah.
And so I say to you, hard-nosed client, recession-proof supplier change, uh, let's talk because I know the way you presented the problem makes it insoluble.
Mm,
And so my gift to you is helping you reframe the problem to the statement in a more actionable way. So let's engage some people and find out what's underlying your helplessness about supply chains and shrinking workforces.
My gosh, I had no idea that you have your perspective. Flawless consulting has been the foundation of my work for 30 years, and I didn't know. It's like another one of those moments about the fish in the water, like saying, "How's the water?" Like, "Where did you learn what you learned?" I learned everything from you. Like, this whole perspective is like,
I know.
this is so amazing. Like, my one of my clients, her name is Katie Anderson, and she always talks about the chain of learning, and like, you're the source of the chain of learning that I bring out to other people. This is amazing.
Well,
I don't even know what to say in terms of gratitude for you coming on my
well,
show.
but gratitude, thank you. I like hearing that. But you have a small version of what you're describing. That the reader creates the book, that you have found a way to customize the gift I gave you, okay? And you can't fully attribute it to me as being the Yankee in the chain of learning. You and that's what you're doing with your clients and with your life, is to help people realize that even though they're grateful to you, it doesn't explain anything. And even us talking together, I mean, it's beautiful for me to be so seen and understood, but you're taking it places nobody else would have imagined. And your friend Katie, is that her name?
Uh-huh.
She's taking you places that you wouldn't imagine, and she's your damn client.
Mhm.
Who's paying who here? That and that perspective takes us somewhere. That means something's gonna happen because we spent this time together. And even the hard-nosed executive, I just don't wanna be brought in by his helplessness and his complaints. And if you wanna talk about the world, that's a conversation of opinions. We'll do that, but not during the day. And
Mhm.
I don't invite people to complain about anything, even though they're right, because it doesn't take us anywhere. That's what you get, Betsy. You have internalized and deepened for 30 years a way of being in the world, and each of us gets credit for having, you know, it's like impressionism. It used to be that the point was to make a painting as accurate as possible about what you were looking at. And then somebody started doing squares and scribbles, and Jackson Pollock dribbled the paint. And he said, I'm more interested in the experience of the viewer than I am in the skill of the artist.
Mm.
And I don't know, I just feel it takes us somewhere with that perspective. We all do it in our own way, you know, take what you, but your commitment to bring that into the world uh, tells people that it's possible. And it's hard and it may not even work. Sometimes you do things and you have all the great theory and wrote the book and it's a disaster. I can tell you every time I was in a room where something didn't work, and most of the time I shouldn't have been in the room, but I need the job, I need the work. I like, I gave a talk once, they paid me a lot of money. I said, "I don't think I'm right for this talk. You have to come, Peter. We already advertised you." I said, "Okay," and they sent a limo to pick me up to my talk, okay? And he leaves the hotel, makes a U-turn, and the venue was right across the street from where I was staying. And I thought, here I am driving in a limousine to cross the street. Who have I become? And so that's why that all these things matter. That's why what you're doing.
Thank you. We've taught so many rich things that we talked about. We talked a lot about, flawless consulting, your journey, how you got to activating the common good. Um, we didn't really touch that much on design learning, your for profit, which I am very excited to have your managing partner, Beverly, come on the show next. But is there anything else that you would wanna tell me about, your philosophy, what you want my audience to know? If you could speak to a whole bunch of purpose-driven consultants and coaches who are equal fanboys, girls, and thems out there who are just like me, what would you say to
Or
us? Or is
not.
there or not? No, but they all are, because everybody's gonna be like, "Oh my god, she's fangirling out. She's just like me." What
The
would you is there anything else that you wanna share with us?
the the challenge is to embody. It's one thing to have a point of view, have a set of ideas, and then the challenge is how do you embody it, and can you learn how to create experiences that capture it. You can't make a difference in the world by explaining what you're up to or explaining why it's important. It's a mythology of research. I'm happy with research, but being right doesn't make a difference. It just feels good.
Mm.
And so we started in the early days saying, okay, we can't just talk about or write about. We have to design in 2 or 3 days experiences that allow people to quickly learn how simple this is if you just try it. And so that's what we've done is with the 6 conversations, the leader is convener. We're trying to say, look, a leadership is not about role modeling. It's about bringing people together, connecting them to decide what you wanna do about the recession, what you wanna do about this supply chain. It's okay, and so that's what design learning was. That's why we called it designed learning, and slowly over the years, we just said, "Look at, uh, we have the means in a short period of time to help you not only shift your thinking, but also realize you have the skills and ability to, connect with people as a leverage point." And so the whole time is designed in small groups mostly. Maria Montessori said the hardest thing she is about Montessori is getting teachers to stop teaching. And so the hardest thing with us when we do workshops is to shut up. Not one of my strengths. Okay. And
Mhm. Mine either.
I know. And so I just invite people to consider this as a short, efficient vehicle to let people experience another way of being together. And then they can repeat it all, forever. And some places decide, "Well, we're gonna make this central to our way of being." They have internal people that run the workshops, but it's really about designed experiences that embody the stuff I write and talk about.
And that's at designedlearning.com,
Yeah,
designed with ed learning.com, correct?
yeah, that'll do it. And then you'll have Beverly who embodies all of that.
And then as it relates to you have your own website as well, like, it seems like you have multiple websites.
I do.
Which is
I
the best
pick up
place
on
for people to connect with you?
uh, well, the ideas are on Restore Commons. Uh, and there I needed a place where I heard somebody give a talk or a video or something, or me in a conversation like this, okay, that changes everything, okay, and then all you long for with what you do is that what you do embodies what you're talking about. Pivot. And that's what being with you is like. And so I put those all on restorecommons.something.com. Restore Commons. But Design Learn's all you need. They all take you wherever you wanna go. It's just that when I work with different people, sometimes we plant things in different places. But
That
I
makes
find
sense.
it but the other thing I'm doing now is something called the Common Good Alliance. So we're trying to bring the ideas from Activate the Common Good into neighborhoods.
Mm.
So in businesses, we call them teams, divisions, departments. In cities, neighborhood is is the as big as you wanna get if you wanna see a real change. But all that's next time.
And all your books are on Amazon, I would assume,
Well,
and
they're on Powell Books. I don't
for sure, everybody needs this book who is a consultant, and then everybody who cares about the world, you need this book. Wait, am I getting it in here? You need these books
yeah, but
as well.
buy it from your local bookstore.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yes, buy it from your local bookstore, that is so accurate, you're
It's
right.
more expensive, it's slow, and that's the point. Transformation is my willingness to be inconvenienced, small and slow.
Oh, I'm sorry, I bought the Activating Common Good on Amazon, 'cause
I don't care.
but but it but you're right, 'cause that is one of the things that you had mentioned in Activating the Common Good, is, like, staying local and locally sourced
Right.
and urban farming, so you're right, I was doing the opposite of what I was supposed to be doing, but I didn't read the book yet, so I didn't know. So now I do. This has been an amazing conversation. I cannot thank you enough. I am beyond grateful. I definitely would love for to stay in touch and be
We are in
connected
touch.
and
Nothing changes that.
connected. Stay
We are
connected.
connected. No, me too, Betsy, your commitment and the blessing of your own language and speaking is beautiful. So, I really appreciate we'll do stuff together, but we don't need a plan to be connected, okay?
Thank you.
And you can
Thank
help
you.
me think about what I'm thinking about. That's what I need.
Ooh, I'm good at that. I would love to do
I
that.
know you're good at that. How much data do I need?
That would be amazing. I would love that. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I cannot wait to talk to your managing director, Beverly Crowell. Is that how I pronounce her last name?
Close enough.
She will be on the show next. And thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, and for following what the person said all those years ago who was begging you to write a book, and that you actually followed through and you continue to write books because you make a difference every day.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you. As we end this episode, I invite you to reflect on Peter's deep wisdom, especially around how our relationship skills really are the delivery mechanism of our expertise. What he talked about as it relates to the illusion of control and how nobody, even the top executives, have control. I loved what we got into about the differences between control and power, the prevailing myths that are out there that affect our own thinking and how we show up in the world around scarcity and division, and how a flawless consulting approach, this relationship and collaborative approach, is what's needed in any economy. And as a branding person, I'd be remiss if I did not draw out what I love what Peter said about looking for clients who are looking for us. So, the question I invite you to consider is, how easy or hard are you making it for the people who are looking for you to get what you do? So, in our next episode, I'm beyond excited to continue this dialogue with Beverly Crowell, who's Peter's managing director for his for profit arm Design Learning. So, be sure to subscribe or follow Consulting Matters on your podcast player or on YouTube so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for being a part of my inner circle of purpose driven consultants and coaches, where we change the world together, one client or conversation at a time. So I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day. And a quick reminder, if you want to level up your own consulting or coaching business, now is the time, because I'm offering specials for I'm just getting out of sabbatical, and I'm providing some discounts for people who are signing up now. So be sure to check out my website and my programs. And if you have been on the fence about wanting to work with me, now is your time to act. So again, thanks for listening, and I'm so glad you're part of my community.